Kia ora koutou. I have a theory. It's not based on any hard facts, science or academic research, but rather generated as a result of various experiences as a New Zealand Army officer. Most recently drawn from observations made as a future operations planner in a multinational coalition headquarters. The theory being that due to our broad understanding of military planning, New Zealand Army officers are well placed within a coalition environment to contribute effectively to complex operational problem solving. How we as New Zealand officers are trained and developed as staff officers, along with our application of knowledge and understanding within our operating environments, can be directly attributed to this training. As a small army of just over 5,000, we're required to be adaptive and flexible in our response. As recent deployments and outputs demonstrate, we're required to plan in and for a variety of contexts, whether these be from training missions in Iraq and Afghanistan to disaster relief efforts both domestically in New Zealand and in the Pacific. How therefore do we prepare and train our staff officers to plan and operate in such a wide range of contexts? And at times, these contexts are inherently complex in nature. In general terms, the New Zealand Army trains its officers within a training model that is heavily aligned to what we refer to as all corps or all arms. Firstly, it trains its officers in their trade specialty, enabling individuals to contribute their knowledge and experience within a staff environment. Secondly, it then takes these same individuals and trains them to be staff officers, exposing them to a broad range of military doctrine, planning techniques and warfighting principles, to give them a broad understanding of military staff planning processes and its applications. The intent being that by having an individual trained through the system, it enables its staff officers to support New Zealand operational planning contributions. The primary planning tool that we use in the New Zealand Army is the military appreciation process, of which application can vary dependent on the context of the planning that is being conducted, whether this be an individual, in an Army headquarters, a joint multinational headquarters. The process requires inputs of knowledge from experts or specialists to better understand the overall problem and develop potential solutions to this problem. How we then link this knowledge to the process is important. In my recent experience as a future operations planning officer, I was responsible day to day for leading operational planning teams, commonly referred to as OPTs. Doctrinally, this is a tasked, organised team established to solve complex problems in support of a commander's decision-making process. According to US Marine Corps doctrine, the aim of this planning team is to gather the right subject matter experts or SMEs to better integrate planning efforts and develop a cross-functional shared understanding of the problem, therefore creating a coherent and executable operations plan. As an OPT lead, the key role I had was to draw all this knowledge together of these SMEs or specialists and then develop an overarching conceptual plan. This was based on the principle that the majority of the technical detailed planning would be done at the lower command tactical level at a later date. During these operational planning team sessions, I observed several things. Generally, the larger the planning team, the slower the planning effort became, and this often resulted in an increased amount of out-of-session planning requirements to achieve the overall planning effect. Smaller teams, however, appeared to be more agile and flexible in their problem solving. They did not seem to be constrained by the technical information that specialists were being provided, and thereby reducing any roadblocks that were in the way. The key point here being that the highly specialised team members could at times take the planning efforts down what I refer to as rabbit holes. It was more productive to have that technical detailed planning conducted out of session and then fed back into the loop later on. I personally tended to gather a smaller planning team, including those most critical staff functions, in order to generate an initial problem framework and then generate the plan. whereby I observed colleagues from larger militaries would often gather a larger team and have all those experts included right up front. Broadly speaking, I would often get greater success, especially in those early stages of the planning. Frequently, I would achieve a planning outcome or an order for execution in a much shorter time frame or a much more concise manner. Now, maybe this was down to the complexity of the problem that we were solving. However, my reflection has led me to believe that in part this was based on my ability to understand concepts and then link them together, drawing all those specialist ideas and knowledge and forming them into the plan. A good example of smaller planning teams is the application of what is called skip echelons. This is a principle that US Marine Corps General James Mattis employed many times while holding various command appointments in the US military. He was known to operate with a smaller staff, believing that the efficiencies gained could generate a faster decision-making cycle, ultimately leading to the success of his mission. This required, though, a greater trained state for his staff and a considerable level of trust amongst the team to be successful. The smaller staff footprint, coupled with the team cohesion and trust, enabled improved command and control and encouraged greater critical thinking. Often the team would search for those out-of-box solutions. Where the staff then lacked some knowledge or a specific function was required to be inputted or performed into the planning process, the skip echelon approach would be employed. Essentially what would happen, and they would gain the input that was required from units either up or down the chain of command. When he commanded the 1st Marine Corps Division in 2003, he expected every staff member to basically share their workload. And there's a really good quote that summarises it here from a US Marine Major, Michael Valenti. So my theory. Given the small size and output requirements of the New Zealand Army, we don't necessarily have the ability to deliver capabilities on that same grand scale as larger militaries might. This leads directly to our limited ability to develop SMEs or technical operators to deliver these capabilities on such a mass scale, and also in multiple complex environments. How do we then replicate the required knowledge to deliver capabilities in line with our commitments and in conjunction with these coalition partners of ours? I would argue that we can't. Trying to match coalition partners' capabilities is just not realistic and or very cost effective. I believe we need to maintain a model that allows individuals to have a certain level of knowledge but over a few different capabilities, and then enables the organisation to still maintain the required skill sets to meet these outputs. Hence the development of my theory, depth versus breadth, and understanding how this is applied within a planning environment to support problem solving and ultimately the decision maker. This application is knowledge versus understanding. So if we look at knowledge being the skills gained from experience and or education and training, this can be represented on a scale from the highly technical through to the more generalist in nature. Based on my observations, generally someone that has a high level of technical knowledge or skill has less of an understanding across other capabilities. Now, from what I've observed, a military that is large in scale appear to have many individuals that have this high level of technical knowledge. This knowledge can then be represented as individuals who have a particular set of skill sets within a broad capability. And this is one way of creating breadth of understanding. If I reflect now on this theory and overlap New Zealand Army's training of its staff officers, we haven't got that ability to develop this depth of technical knowledge with such a small pool of people. So rather than foregoing the skill sets completely, we develop an individual across multiple skill sets, enabling understanding across a capability. How then does this knowledge versus understanding affect the overall planning process itself? The 80-20 rule, or Pareto principle, is named after Italian economist Vilfredo Pareto and refers to the unequal relationship between inputs and outputs. In this instance, if we look though at 100% of knowledge being required to solve a problem, there is a significant amount of SME input required to achieve this. Based on my previous observations, it is likely to slow down the problem solving with all that knowledge basically overloading the problem solving process. Do we then actually need all this knowledge to then solve the problem? My observations indicated that no, not really. And this is where having that broad understanding or breadth of the problem adds some value. As a generalisation, and then coupling this with the 80-20 rule, I therefore believe you actually only need about 80% of that knowledge to produce the sufficient plan in order to solve a problem, recognising that the majority of results or outputs can come from the minority of inputs. So if we refer to the model again, and we will apply the 80-20 rule, you can get an indication of the level of knowledge input likely to be required for staff planning. You can see that getting that extra 20% there is probably going to take a considerable amount of technical or SME knowledge. And this is probably not going to contribute a great deal to the overall planning efforts itself. What becomes apparent, though, is how this knowledge is coordinated and then fused together to generate an overall understanding of the plan. This is where I believe the planning team lead is critical in ensuring that a fusion occurs. They need to be in a position to make conceptual linkages and pull all that technical knowledge and inputs together, basically to then execute the plan. Doesn't it therefore require that you have a broader thinking staff officer, someone that understands just a little bit of everything and can identify those cross-functional issues that are relevant to the planning effort? While my theory highlights some key benefits and efficiencies in support of staff planning and problem solving, there are two main risks that I identified with this model. Firstly, that a single function has not been identified to contribute to the planning process. Effectively, the lead planner just doesn't know what they don't know. This may result in an inability to identify internal risks and or synchronisation efforts required to deliver the plan. Effectively, a knowledge gap has been created in the cross-functional planning team. This is where having an OPT lead that does have a broad understanding is important to limit this gap. Alternatively, having multiple planners within the team that have a broad understanding across many functions would saturate the planning effort enough to identify any contribution shortfalls. Secondly, there is a risk that lead planners believe they have all the functional knowledge themselves and create too small a planning team up front, or then don't seek out the specialist input knowledge that is required. This may result in some technical information or data being left out of the planning effort and result in planning or operational risk. Unfortunately, this type of risk is driven at an individual level. However, it can be mitigated by good command direction and additionally the wargaming process later on in the staff planning activity. This has contributions from all staff functions that should at that point identify if there's a knowledge gap. So, what did my observations and experiences solidify for me? Firstly, that smaller, more tasked, organised planning teams can solve complex problems. Knowing when to draw on the specialist knowledge is the key. Secondly, that the role of the planning team lead to knit and fuse that knowledge and understanding together is vital to the success of the planning outcomes. Thirdly, that having a broad view of the planning process enables the ability to solve complex problems, and the depth of knowledge can still be generated from a broad understanding. Finally, from a New Zealand Army perspective, I believe its training model does develop its staff officers to have a broad understanding of the operational planning process, and that these officers ultimately know when or how to draw on specialist knowledge to complement and enhance the operational plan. Given the size of the organisation, I believe the right balance is being applied between developing depth of knowledge and breadth of understanding. Thank you.